All right, we're live. Let's wait a few minutes for people to join. But welcome in on this Thursday afternoon, a big day today, May 21st, 2026. Today we're going to talk about NOAA's hurricane season forecast, which dropped probably the most anticipated hurricane season forecast that everybody's waiting for all year. And it is an interesting hurricane forecast, that's for sure. In fact, I literally have it on the thumbnail card here, so you kind of already get a preview of what we're going to be talking about today. But I don't want to start just yet. Let's wait a few minutes for people to actually join here, since nobody's in the chat just yet. But I'm pretty sure people will join as time goes along. So let's wait a minute before we start getting some people in. But we're going to talk about NOAA's forecast. We're going to go over why NOAA predicted what they did. We're going to go over some factors like El Nino and how sea surface temperatures are right now. We're also going to go over comparing now this year to some past years, and I've done this before. We're going to compare this year to past super El Nino years, especially on the likes of years like 2015 and 1997, and we're going to also compare the Pacific as well to other active Pacific years, because it really looks like we're going to have an active Pacific hurricane season, that is for sure. But I'm also going to go over and show you guys some, seasons in the Atlantic that were also not necessarily active, but El Nino does not always mean that we are going to have absolutely no activity or no substantial activity in the Atlantic to be worried about. We have had substantial impacts and bad storms in El Nino years before in the Atlantic, and that's probably a theme that I'm going to try to, beat into everybody's heads this year. Even if there's no El Nino, I do believe we're still going to get that one strong storm this year. So we're going to go over quite a bit in today's live discussion. I'm pretty sure as we go on, people are going to start joining. So let's waste no more time in getting started. Obviously today, May 21st, Thursday, 2026. Hope you all are having a great day. Let's start off by taking a look at and talking about one of the most highly anticipated things of today's video, or of today in general, and that is the fact that NOAA has released their 2026 Atlantic hurricane season forecast. And as predictable, as you probably were able to guess, they are predicting a below normal hurricane season for the Atlantic. And in fact, I actually have their forecast card, their forecast, graphic up here on full screen. NOAA is officially predicting 18 to 14 named storms, 3 to 6 hurricanes, and 1 to 3 major hurricanes in the Atlantic, with a 55% chance of a below normal season, 35% chance of a near normal season, and a 10% chance of an above normal season for the Atlantic this year. This is probably the first below normal hurricane season forecast that NOAA has released since at least 2018, but especially when it comes to releasing a below normal hurricane season forecast in May, that has probably not occurred since 2015. So as I've been saying over the past several weeks, this year is looking like it's going to be a pretty different year compared to the last several years that we've been used to. I mean, we've been having nonstop, very active hurricane seasons since 2016, or we would have 1 or 2 years like 2022 where activity would be, not as much as other years, but we've just been having quite extraordinary, destructive, crazy seasons for the past 10 years consistently, and this year looks like it'll finally be the first year where we see less activity. But once again, I'll talk about that more in a little bit. Less activity does not equal no activity, and you know what, I'm probably going to use that as a phrase as we go throughout the entire hurricane season this year. But this is NOAA's hurricane forecast for the Atlantic. Below normal season on the cards for this year. And then they forecasted as well for the Pacific. They released an Atlantic forecast and an Eastern and Central Pacific forecast as well. And also predictably, they predict a quite busy Pacific hurricane season. They forecast right now 15 to 22 named storms, 9 to 14 hurricanes, and 5 to 9 major hurricanes, with an ACE expected to be anywhere between 120 to 190% above the median ACE. And so an actual ACE, so in the actual, predicted ACE value, that is roughly anywhere from, I believe, 140 to 200 ACE. So the Eastern Pacific is expected to be very active, and I've been driving that point home pretty strongly for the past several weeks. And I think it's looking more favorable by the day in terms of the Pacific hurricane season this year. And of course, we'll go over the factors as to why in just a little bit. But in the Eastern Pacific as well, we have predicted chances for activity in the Atlantic below normal at 55% chance, with above normal only at 10% chance in the Atlantic. But again, that's probably the lowest below normal percent chance I've seen for an Atlantic hurricane forecast in a while. But the Eastern Pacific, on the other hand, and the Central Pacific too, is expected to have an above normal season, and their percentage chance of that is 70%. So quite an active hurricane season expected in the Pacific, and the Central Pacific as well is also expected to be very active. 5 to 13 tropical cyclones is expected there this year, and you may say that 13 is quite a bit, but I assume that NOAA is more than likely talking about storms that will generally be in the basin this year. I don't think this number actually means storms that'll form in the Central Pacific alone. Otherwise, 13 would be quite insane. But even then, 13 is still very active, and the Central Pacific is likely going to be very, very active this year. And that probably means trouble for Hawaii. So if you're in Hawaii, and especially if you are anywhere along the Pacific coastline this year, make sure to prepare and have your hurricane plan ready, because we are looking at a very active hurricane season this year. And even in the Atlantic too, we're expecting a below normal season this year, but once again, below normal hurricane activity does not always equal no hurricane activity. So if you are anywhere near a coastline this year that is susceptible to hurricane impacts, please make sure to prepare, and make sure to start preparing now. We are still very early on in the season. But why does NOAA forecast what they forecast? What is the reasoning behind what they show? And the number one reason, I think you can all guess it. We've been talking about it for the last several weeks. But we are going to have a major El Nino in the Pacific this year. In fact, it is already begun pretty much. And you can take a look at the latest sea surface temperature anomaly map here. This is from the NOAA Coral Reef Watch, updated as of yesterday, but this map is always a day behind. That's just how they update it, but at least it's updated on a daily basis, so that's good. But you can see very, very warm sea surface temperature anomalies here building along the equatorial Pacific. In fact, we have many areas along the equatorial Pacific here already shaded in with anomalies as much as 1 degree Celsius above normal. And you can even already start to see these much warmer shades of maybe 2 to even 3 degrees Celsius above normal beginning to appear in the Eastern Pacific and off the South American coastline. But especially as it relates to the Eastern Pacific hurricane season, pretty much the entirety of the tropical Pacific is very, very warm, especially off the Baja Peninsula this year. And that is something that always stood out, especially from wintertime, and especially off the coast of Mexico here. Boy, is this going to be a concern, in my opinion, for Mexico in terms of the Pacific hurricane season this year. And I'll actually show you what the actual sea surface temperatures are off the Mexican coastline in just a little bit, but they are especially seeing very, very warm above normal sea surface temperatures. Again, some of these shadings here reaching as much as 3 degrees Celsius above normal. And this map, by the way, I feel like I don't really explain what sea surface temperature anomalies actually mean. This map is representative of how the sea surface temperatures are compared to what the long-term average is. So when we're talking about anomalies, we're talking about compared to normal, compared to the statistical average for at least the last 30 or so years. And when we compare the current sea surface temperature anomalies right now to the average for the last 30 years, the Pacific is very, very warm, and the Atlantic, on the other hand, is not too warm, but still not too cool either. And NOAA actually mentioned that in their hurricane forecast, saying that that's a little bit of a wild card for this year. Maybe the fact that we still have some warmth in the Atlantic will allow for some opportunities for tropical development, a little bit more than, if the Atlantic was just completely cold. But I mean, in general, this is just a part of the fact that the Atlantic has been warm, and in a warm phase of the AMO, the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation, a term that I like to mention quite a bit, and especially if you've been following me for the past year, or if you've been following me for a long while, I like to talk about the AMO quite a bit. And the Atlantic has just in general been in a warm pattern for the last 20 or 30 years. I believe it's, we're going on 30 years now since this warm pattern really started in 1995. And that's also when we really started getting a lot of activity in the Atlantic too. The warmth is still with us this year. Obviously not as much as past years, but I did read on the website here, and let's actually go over it. Let's see. Although El Niño's impact in the Atlantic Basin can often suppress hurricane development, there's still uncertainty in how each season will unfold, and that's why he says that you got to prepare. But I think it's the paragraph before here. El Niño is expected to develop and intensify during the hurricane season, while ocean temperatures in the Atlantic are expected to be slightly warmer than normal, and trade winds are likely weaker than average, and they do say that these are competing factors. The Atlantic is still warm this year, and either way, even though the season is not going to be above normal or very active, I do still think that we're going to have an opportunity for something to happen in the Atlantic Basin. So I would not, completely place your bets on only tracking the Pacific this year. If you are in the Atlantic, especially if you are anywhere in the Caribbean or along the U.S. coast, please make sure to be prepared and be ready for this hurricane season in case something happens. Because, I've mentioned this before, but interestingly enough, if you look at where all of the warmest sea surface temperature anomalies are right now, they are all closer to home, especially here off the southeast coast, and especially here off the New England coast. We've really been seeing sea surface temperature anomalies warm up quite significantly here over the last several days, and we've had a huge heat ridge in the eastern portion of the United States, and it's finally cooling down a little bit, at least today here in New York City. Prior to today, we've had pretty much a several-day streak, in fact, pretty much almost a week long, of temperatures in the upper 80s and 90s, and that's just in general been the case for huge portions of the East Coast. So we're seeing that reflected pretty well in the sea surface temperature anomaly map, but in general throughout the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico too, and even in general across the southwestern Atlantic, sea surface temperature anomalies are very, very warm. And that's important because that's where we all live. We don't live out in the deep tropics of the Atlantic. I mean, some people live in, the Cape Verde Islands or the Cabo Verde Islands, but they don't really get the brunt of all of the major hurricane or intense hurricane activity. They usually only get the tropical waves that come off, that begin to develop and turn into major hurricanes that eventually go on to impact us. Some go out to sea, but some impact us, and especially if we are warmer this year, closer to the Atlantic, it's very important that we watch things still. I don't think that I do not think that this year will be a complete shutout, even if we have El Nino. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in just a little bit. But once again, going back to El Nino, taking a look at the Nino 3.4 sea surface temperature anomalies right now. The latest value is at 0.6 degrees Celsius above normal. And ever since April, it's been a pretty steady and pretty significant upward trend. And this is likely only going to continue for the next several weeks. The MJO is going to move into the Pacific. And we'll also talk about this a little bit more later on, but we're going to have a pretty significant westerly wind burst, more than likely. And El Nino is going to really kick into high gear over these next several weeks. So this anomaly chart map is just going to continue to go up and up and up until we reach the peak, which will probably be sometime this fall. And the weekly Nino 3.4 chart from the Climate Prediction Center also now beginning to reflect El Nino conditions, or at least El Nino sea surface temperature anomalies. The latest weekly value from the Nino 3.4 at 0.5 degrees Celsius above normal. So we're continuing to see the tropical Pacific warm up as El Nino continues to arrive. And I mean, not only is it arriving, but it's pretty much already here at this point, you could say. And then in the Atlantic, sea surface temperature anomalies hovering just slightly above normal, although much closer to near normal again, but not super cold, as I'll especially explain, as I'll show you, some other years in just a little bit, but still near normal, slightly above normal in the Atlantic MDR. This is going to fluctuate too, especially this time of year as we get a lot of Saharan air out in the eastern Atlantic. That tends to affect how satellites read SST temperatures, because we get a lot of our sea surface temperature data from satellite data. If you didn't know, you would think that we would get it from buoys, but we actually get a lot of it from sea surface temperatures. So they tend to get affected whenever we have major Saharan air. So this map kind of fluctuates quite a bit, especially early on in the season, but still above normal, at least for now. So because of that, El Nino generally means warmer water in the Pacific, which obviously means more rising motion in the atmosphere. We have more thunderstorm activity, and because of that, we have more hurricane development in the Pacific. So obviously, we're going to have an above normal Pacific season there, and that is more than likely going to cause strong wind shear. That's one of the main symptoms as to why El Nino is not really considered a favorable factor for the Atlantic, and obviously that should put a damper on hurricane season. Most of you, especially if you've been tracking hurricanes for long enough, you guys know that by now, but for those that don't, if you're a new tracker or you're just somebody who casually, is just trying to receive information on the tropics, this is why, especially when it comes to El Nino this year, probably one of the biggest factors for hurricane season. This is why we're expecting an above normal season in the Pacific and a less than normal season, a quieter season, more than likely, in the Atlantic. And then when it comes to El Nino as well, it's going to be strong. We are already at El Nino threshold right now in mid-May, and El Nino development is really going to kick into high gear over the next several weeks, and I'll show you why a little bit later on. So very, very likely we're going to see a very strong El Nino this year, and pretty much all of the models predict it now. This is the Climate Prediction Center IRI model ENSO forecast, which was released for this month not long ago, and the green line here represents the statistical average, and the red line here represents the dynamical average, and both lines are pretty much hovering. Both of them, both of the averages here are above 1.5, so that's the threshold for strong El Nino. But then the dynamical average actually goes above 2 Celsius into super El Nino threshold, and the statistical average stays slightly below it. But both models expect, or both averages here, I assume they are an average of the dynamical models and the statistical models that we have on this plot, because I guess there's just so many models. You gotta kind of condense it into averages. But both of them are expecting strong El Nino, which means virtually all of the models out there are expecting a very strong El Nino, and in fact, a lot of them are expecting a Super Nino. And in fact, a lot of them, or not a lot of them, but a number of them are expecting that we will potentially even see a record-breaking strong El Nino, which is possible. I mean, I'll show you with the anomalies, especially in the subsurface. We have a lot of subsurface warmth, and El Nino still has a long way to go in terms of development. So we might as well be about to witness I wouldn't say once in a lifetime, but a historical El Nino, probably one of the strongest we will see for the next several decades to come. And to kind of prove that point, let's actually compare this year to past Super El Nino years, not just for the sake of comparing and seeing how strong this El Nino is going to get, but also let's compare and pay attention as well to how this year compares to many of these years, which I'll show you right now, which were all very active hurricane seasons in the Pacific. But first, let's start off with 2015, and let's first, get a base idea of what we have this year so far. We have very, very warm sea surface temperature anomalies, obviously throughout the tropical Pacific, and then we have already quite a ton of warm water here. Many of these shadings as much, or as at least 2 degrees Celsius. Some areas already achieving higher than that. How does that look like compared to 2015? Aligns pretty well. I mean, we have similar shadings of sea surface temperature anomalies already beginning to build off of Latin America, and the Eastern Pacific. Quite interestingly, the Eastern Pacific, you could honestly say, is warmer than 2015. So we're already on par with more than likely the strength of how the El Nino was in this time in 2015. What about 2023? And let's compare that to this year. Let's see how they compare. We're likely already ahead of 2023, it seems. We had some warmth building here in the Eastern Pacific, but it looks like it's still kind of mainly confined to South America right now. And interestingly enough, I mean, in 2023, we still very much had a negative PDO with much colder sea surface temperature anomalies in the tropical MDR of the Eastern Pacific, and we still ended up having a very active season that year, as I'll show you in a little bit. 2023 in the Pacific ended up producing storms like Otis, which was a Cat 5 hit head-on to Acapulco, Mexico. I think you guys all remember that. And comparing that to this year, I mean, it's night and day, especially in the Eastern Pacific. Man, are things significantly warmer, and combined with a already ahead equatorial warming situation happening here. So you would maybe say that we are probably going to get a stronger El Nino than 2023. But then very importantly, too, I must note, compare this year to, how we were in 2023 in the Atlantic. We had a very, very warm Atlantic Ocean in 2023. Many people say and credit that to the reason why, despite the fact that we had a pretty strong El Nino in 2023 in the Pacific, we still ended up having an above normal hurricane season in the Atlantic, and we are definitely nowhere near that level of warmth. In fact, you can kind of say that we almost have an inverse look, especially with these kind of cooler sea surface temperature anomalies beginning to show up here in the northeastern Atlantic, compared to what we had in 2023. So we're not going to have that competing factor, which maybe might have put a lid on things in the Pacific a little bit, and maybe even put a lid on the intensity of El Nino. One might question. So that is not present this year. All of the warmth is concentrated in the Pacific this year compared to 2023. And then 1997, let's compare to how we look like this year. Slightly warmer in 1997, especially off the coast of Latin America here. But in terms of the equatorial Pacific, we seem to be pretty much right on par with 97. In fact, especially if you want to consider these anomalies here in the Eastern Pacific, we're even slightly ahead of 1997. So two of these years already, 2015 and 1997, were record strong El Niños. I mean, both of them are pretty much the strongest El Niños that we have seen in the past 20 to 30 years. And so we are already on par with those seasons. So that is pretty significant, I must say. But very interestingly enough as well, the tropical Eastern Pacific is much warmer than we were in 1997. I mean, in general, the oceans are warmer today than they were in 1997. I'm not sure if it's that much of a big deal, but I mean, I'd say that no matter what, we're probably going to get, if there's any one thing that I think this, we could use this as a benchmark for, is potentially saying that we will have a more active season, Eastern Pacific hurricane season, than 1997. And then finally, I threw this year in, especially because it was the most active Eastern Pacific hurricane season in recent history in terms of ACE that we had that year, 2018, and let's especially compare the Eastern Pacific warm pool from 2018 to this year, and very interestingly enough, significantly warmer this year already. Plus the fact that we had we have a much stronger El Nino this year, that's for sure. 2018, we only had a, barely weak El Nino that tried developing but kind of failed, but ended up, barely succeeding later on. So I find it very interesting that we had a not as favorable look, especially for the Eastern Pacific in 2018, especially when compared to this year. But 2018 ended up with the most active hurricane season on record in the Pacific. In fact, let me actually show you what happened. Quite a bit of activity, as you could see. We especially had a lot of Central Pacific activity. If you remember that year, we had Hurricane Lane, which threatened Hawaii. And we also had a major hurricane impact into central Mexico. And let me really quickly zoom out of this, and I'll show you what the ACE index was. A whopping 318 ACE points, which is, as you can see here, a record high. So we had quite an active hurricane season in the Pacific that year. And once again, comparing those 2 years, it's very interesting that we have a more favorable look, in my opinion, to the Pacific than we had in 2018. And then next is 2015, the other really, really favorable year that we had in the Eastern Pacific that year. And I'd say that this year's look is much more comparable to 2015 in that sense. I mean, we have warmer sea surface temperature anomalies in 2015, but out of all of the years that I showed, 2015 has the warmest Eastern Pacific, at least, of course, warmest compared to this year, but this year we are definitely ahead, that's for sure. And how was the 2015 Pacific hurricane season? Well, near record active, ACE as high as 290, and I believe that, hold on, let me see if I can find the ACE, records here, because I think they have a table. Let me see, can I scroll down and find it? No, I cannot. I thought they had a table showing, all of the activity in terms of ACE of the most active years in the Pacific, but 2015 is definitely up there in terms of being one of the most active Pacific hurricane seasons. And 2015 as well was the last time we had a super El Nino. So very interesting year that we could potentially compare to for this year. And then we also had 2023 as well, the last El Nino we had. Not as active of a year. I mean, especially when you go back and look at the pattern that we had in 2023. Let's see where it is. Where is it? 2023 here. You did have some of these warmer sea surface temperature anomalies, which kind of cap things, you could say, or cooler, I should say. Blue is cooler and orange is warmer. Got my colors mixed up. But we had cooler sea surface temperature anomalies in the tropical Eastern Pacific, even though we had a pretty strong El Nino that year. So that definitely kept a lid on things. But even then, still, we had a above normal season. We had storms like Otis, which were very, very impactful to Mexico. And we ended up having 8 major hurricanes in the Eastern Pacific that year. So that is quite incredible. And then finally, 1997, another significant hurricane season as well. We had 7 major hurricanes that year. And I'm not sure what the ace was. 160, so right near what we had in 2023. And I guess it makes sense we didn't have as warm of a Pacific, especially compared to this year, or especially compared to 2015. But we still had a warm Pacific, and we still had a very active hurricane season then. So the bottom line, a very active hurricane season is coming in the Pacific, and I would not be surprised if we especially have to lean towards 2015 or 2018, I should say, and 2015 in terms of the kind of outcome we're going to have from this year. And it's very interesting, especially that those are the top years that we could compare to, because 2015 and 2018 were the most active Pacific hurricane seasons in recent history. And we have a very, very comparable look to both of those years, even more so to 2015, which was, pretty much almost as active as 2018. So a very active Pacific hurricane season is coming, and I'm going to continue to write that point home for as long as the season happens, until either it happens or it doesn't happen. Of course, we'll see what Mother Nature ends up doing, but bottom line, very active Pacific hurricane season coming. But then I want to talk about the Atlantic. And I have 2018 up on here, but first let's actually, go back to the sea surface temperature chart here. And I see a lot of people online saying that the look, the, SST configuration, the look that we have to this hurricane season is very, very unfavorable. It does not look like we're going to have an active Atlantic hurricane season at all. And obviously, NOAA's forecast reflects that, because they predict a below normal hurricane season. But in general, when you compare how the Atlantic looks like this year, I mean, it's not really active, but SSTs are generally near to slightly above normal, especially when you compare this year to a year like 2018. 2018, we had very, very cold sea surface temperature anomalies, especially in the eastern portion of the Atlantic, especially off the western coast of Africa here. And if you've been tracking the Atlantic for the last several years, very oftentimes we would quite literally see the inverse. So 2018, we had a very, very cold Atlantic, especially, much colder compared to this year. I mean, we are very, very warm by comparison to 2018. Yet, this is how the 2018 hurricane season panned out. It was still active. We still had a decent amount of activity. And we still ended up having storms like Florence and Michael. Michael, which was a Category 5 hurricane, landfall on the Florida Panhandle, and obviously Florence as well, which was a pretty devastating hurricane hit for North Carolina. And then another year that I want to bring up, 1965, we ended up having Hurricane Betsy that year. 1965 was yet another very, very strong El Nino, and Hurricane Betsy ended up happening that year, and that storm was a very bad storm for New Orleans. In fact, it's one of New Orleans' benchmark storms, up there with Katrina and Camille, although Camille, I'd say, is maybe a little bit more of a benchmark for Mississippi. But still, you get the point. Betsy was a very, very intense and very impactful storm for New Orleans, and that happened in a strong El Nino year. And then we also have, years like 1992, not very active, but we still ended up having Andrew, which impacted Florida, and Betsy actually ended up impacting Florida as well. So the bottom line is that I still think we're going to get something in the Atlantic. Obviously, this year is not going to be a very active season. In fact, we're probably not even going to see as much activity as we saw in 2018, which, by the way, let me really quickly run you through the numbers. We had 15 named storms, 8 hurricanes, and 2 major hurricanes in 2018, as well as an ace of 132. So we had a pretty active season in 2018, especially considering when this is the setup we had, developing El Nino in the Pacific, and a very, very favorable setup, which would result in a record active East Pacific season and a very cold Atlantic, and we still ended up having an above normal season that year. So pretty much what I'm trying to say is Mother Nature sometimes has other plans, and I would not completely brush off the Atlantic this year, even if things are not looking great. And in fact, let me actually take you to 2015 in the Atlantic. Even though we had a super El Nino that year, we still ended up having Hurricane Joaquin, which was a very impactful storm for the Bahamas. And I'll actually show you the intensity here. Joaquin, 155 miles an hour, so borderline Cat 5, and a pressure of 931 millibars. So very, very intense storm that impacted the Bahamas. And Joaquin, for a while, was actually a threat for the East Coast. Pretty late in the season, but Joaquin was actually a pretty considerable East Coast threat, and it actually caused quite a bit of hype. There was actually quite a bit of hype to go along with it. Obviously, it ended up not materializing, but, there's that. And that was in a very strong El Nino. So the bottom line is that I still believe we are going to get something in the Atlantic no matter what. And like Joaquin, let's go back to 2015 here. Joaquin happened in the Western Atlantic. It reached its peak in the Bahamas. And interestingly enough, let's compare this. Let's look at the sea surface temperature anomalies once again for this year. The warmest sea surface temperature anomalies in the warmest water right now is closer to home in the Bahamas, in the Caribbean, in the Gulf of Mexico, all areas where civilization lives in the Atlantic basin. And those are the areas that are most favorable right now in terms of sea surface temperature anomalies. And pattern-wise, too, the deep tropics tends to get cut off because of El Nino. Again, we have very strong wind shear, but very oftentimes, especially in El Nino years, we tend to see a lot of development and a lot of, tropical waves and activity that couldn't develop in the MDR end up trying to develop in the general southwestern Atlantic region. So I think we're still going to have to watch this year, especially for the Bahamas and maybe even the Southeast. Do not let your guard down, even though we are, in general, expecting a less than normal hurricane season this year. All right, so we got the hurricane forecasting stuff out of the way. Let's really quickly talk about what is going on now and what to expect over the next several weeks as we progress into the end of this month and June, which is obviously the start of the Atlantic hurricane season. And I've been doing this over the last several days, especially since the Pacific hurricane season started. I've been going over, we've been doing these daily tropical updates, and we've been going over what's been happening. And of course, I've been talking to you about, the potential for development that I believe is there especially as we get towards the end of May and early June. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit right now. But first, going over tropical activity in the Atlantic right now, nothing is expected, at least for now, over the next 7 days. So that's a good thing in the Atlantic, and then in the Pacific as well. Nothing expected yet in the Pacific, but I think that is going to change soon. And I would not be surprised, especially as we get at the end of this month and into next month, that once the cap is, lifted off of the Pacific, and we start having activity here, I would not be shocked if we immediately start seeing a train of storms in the Pacific next month, and that'll probably take us through a significant portion of the hurricane season. It's really looking like we're going to have that kind of year. So nothing expected, though, right now in the Atlantic or the Pacific in the next 7 days, but that's going to change. And you can see it here in the Global Tropical Hazards Outlook issued by the Climate Prediction Center. Week 3, early June, the week of June 3rd to June 9th, the CPC is already highlighting an area of development in the Pacific. And taking a look at the models, and especially the GFS for the 12Z, had a little bit of fun today. And obviously everybody's posting about it on social media, but let me really quickly take you through the next 7 days. Nothing is going to form within the next 7 days specifically, but especially when you look over Central America, you can already begin to see vorticity building. And eventually, there you go. You see a lot of, when you pay attention to the pattern of a lot of these wind bars here, you see general low-level turning occurring over Central America, and then one giant glob of vorticity eventually develops, and that's your Central American gyre pattern. So looks like the GFS is really beginning to pick up on the Central American gyre that will be in place early June. And as you can see, because of that, it seemingly is able to help spin up something in the Pacific here, and that becomes strong. But then you can clearly see that something tries to consolidate in the Atlantic as well. But as we get into the very end of the model time frame here, it ends up becoming a very, very, not very strong, but a pretty strong hurricane. That's 976 millibars, so probably category 2 strength. And obviously, that is not going to happen. This is the GFS being a little bit foolish, but the model is starting to hint at something, and I'd say especially here in the Eastern Pacific, this signal here already starts appearing in the 7 to 10 day time frame. So at least with whatever happens in the Eastern Pacific, it's not as reasonable as whatever the Atlantic shows, right? I mean, this here only happens roughly well past 300 hours out, but whatever signal we have here in the Eastern Pacific already starts getting going by the time we get to, already by the time we get to this time next week. So I would pay attention to the Pacific especially, I've been saying for the past several days, I think the Pacific is going to start really cranking out activity once we get to the end of this month and into the beginning of next month. But there's clearly also a signal as well for the Atlantic. So quite a few things to watch. But, let's look at the EPS. Let me really quickly flip this to the ensemble MSLP members. And the 12Z EPS runs are actually out, and let's see what they show. And that's actually quite a bit of activity here that shows up in the Atlantic on the ensemble forecast of the EPS. We have a few members here in the Bay of Campeche, a few members here in the Northern Gulf, and a few that try to, get going a little bit earlier, but it really seems like the Atlantic starts to light up with, ensembles that really show something as we get into the first few days of June. And then let's take a look at the Eastern Pacific here. Also really begins to light up, especially the first few days of June, close to Mexico. So I'm thinking late May, especially the first few days of June. I think probably the strongest chance, maybe late May, but I think especially for development, it'll probably be the first week of June that we need to watch in the model. But then there are the AI models, and I think this is really going to be the first test to see just how accurate and whether or not AI really is going to lead the way in terms of, tropical development. Because interestingly enough, despite the European ensembles, I'd say the European ensembles are pretty, optimistic that something is going to try to get going in either the Pacific or the Atlantic as we get towards, the first week of June, last week of May. The AI models, nothing. This is the Google AI ensemble plot, and out of the entire model run from start to finish, which is about 300 hours, so this roughly cuts off at around June 3rd. So let's compare that to what it shows here. The Euro has something here, although I'm not really sure if that's accurate, but something here in the Eastern Pacific, especially close to Mexico, really begins to flourish, especially around June 3rd. But compare that to what the AI model has, nothing. Not even anything in the Bay of Campeche. And then there's like one ensemble here off the southeast coast. And then let's actually flip to the Eastern Pacific here. Let's go Eastern Pacific. And let me speed this up because I don't want to be here all day. And yeah, for the entirety of the 312 hours that the Google AI model runs, there is literally nothing that shows up in the Pacific. So I think this is going to be the first test to see whether or not AI is really going to lead the way in modeling. Now, I do believe more than likely, as time goes on, the AI is probably going to pick up onto something. I don't see why not. But maybe they're onto something. But I don't know. I kind of find it hard to believe, especially when you have the EPS. And let's also look at the GFS ensembles as well. And they're definitely very aggressive. They have a multitude of pretty strong ensembles here, especially as we get towards the end of the model run here into early June. One ensemble actually as strong as 952 millibars, and then I see 976, 978, 984. So quite a few strong ensembles here in the Pacific showing up early June, and definitely something else as well showing up in the Atlantic too. So, we have both the European and the GFS ensembles versus the AI ensembles, which show nothing. And actually, you know what? Let me show you the AI FS as well, which seems to be out too. Seemingly not just the Google AI ensemble that shows nothing. Let me really quickly run you through the entire 360 hours out of the AI ensembles. And interestingly enough, they show nothing as well. So the AI models are not very enthused, while the global models right now are enthused that something is going to happen. But I'll be honest with you, I side with the Google AI, not the Google AI. I side with the global models right now because I think things are really going to become favorable by the time we get to early June, and that's not just me saying that. Sometimes you really have to look at the pattern and determine for yourself whether or not you think it's favorable. We use models as a tool to help give us an idea of what is, to be expected, but that's all models are. They are tools. They're not gospel. They are not, whatever they show is verbatim going to happen, but they generally give us a good idea. And especially over time, when you start knowing what to look for, you can kind of already make a decision on your own without having to really wait for the models. Sometimes you're kind of, waiting for the models to come to your idea rather than you latching on to whatever idea the models have. And especially when you look at the velocity potential anomalies here, and this is from the European, and then I'm going to show you the CFS because the European map here seems to be broken for some reason. This forecast has been updated. In fact, I can actually update it for today. You know what? Since we're in a live stream, why not? Let me just update this really quickly. But I'll show you in a little bit. But I think this European chart is actually broken. Let's see. Thursday, 21st. Okay, there we go. So the forecast for the 21st. So the forecast is, the baseline for the forecast is May 21st, 2026. And that's what this black line is supposed to represent. But for some reason, it actually seems to be centered on early May, especially if you look at the dates here. And, because this map is from Europe, they do the date first and then the month instead of, in America, at least where I'm from, and I'm pretty sure most people watching are from, they do the dates, month and day. So, but the black line here, which is supposed to represent, present time, that's based between May 5th and May 11th. But yet the current day today is May 21st. So I think this chart is broken. I don't know why. Hopefully it get fixed. But I think this chart is broken. But, maybe if anybody from the European Weather Center is watching, please take notes and hopefully fix it soon. But I think the general idea you could still, pick out rising motion here, which is the velocity potential, or the velocity potential represents where rising motion and sinking motion in the atmosphere is going to be. And the greens traversing through the Pacific right now, they're especially going to center itself once we get to the Eastern Pacific and the Caribbean in the late May to early June timeframe. And it really, strengthens here. In fact, the anomalies get pretty strong. And this is especially significant because, once again, we're looking at an ensemble mean here with this map. So late May and early June, that's a pretty defined signature, I must say, for rising motion in the Eastern Pacific. And then notice after that as well, once it gets centered here in the Eastern Pacific starting around late May, it eventually stalls and lasts and even gets stronger as we head into next month, June. So that might be the beginnings of a standing wave developing here in the Pacific, meaning a rising motion cell that is stalled, and more than likely that is because of El Nino. So I think this is meaning that favorable conditions are going to come and probably last and stay in the Pacific for quite a while, and that should really, really kick things off when it comes to hurricane season. And then let's take a look at the CFS weekly as well. This is for week 1. We have MJO traversing the Pacific. It was in the Westpac earlier, and the Westpac, by the way, is going to get a pretty strong typhoon more than likely because we have MJO, that which moves through the Pacific. But then week 2 continues to move eastward, very, very strong by the time it gets to the Eastern Pacific here, especially in week 2. And then in week 3, kind of centers itself more in the Eastern Pacific, but also starts to fill into the Atlantic as well. But the center of the rising motion will really be in the Eastern Pacific and maybe the Caribbean here. So generally, when comparing both of the models here, comparing the CFS weekly and the Euro, the time frame that really opens up here especially seems to be week 2 and 3, which of course is the start of June. So I'm telling you right now, that'll be the golden opportunity to watch for tropical development to occur in the Pacific, and probably something to occur in the Atlantic as well, especially since this will more than likely trigger a Central American gyre, something we very often see in the early season, and that definitely helps favor both Atlantic and Pacific activity. But another thing, and I don't know why this happened, another thing that this is really going to help, in my opinion, is with the warm pool, which you can see here right now. The sea surface temperature anomalies in the subsurface of the Pacific. When we have a rising cell centered in the Pacific, that means we'll probably have westerly winds at the surface and in the lower levels of the atmosphere. And of course, westerly winds help warm waters. And that's especially been the case over the last several weeks. And we're really seeing this warm pool now really come together in the equatorial Pacific. And in fact, most of the warmth is really centered over the eastern Pacific right now. And no, I don't want anything to do with this freaking virus monitoring thing. But the but the westerly wind bursts, which will probably be triggered by this rising motion standing wave that we'll have developed here, really going to help all of the very, very copious amounts of subsurface warmth that we have building. Why? Because of El Nino. And we are really probably going to see El Nino development kick into high gear over these next several weeks. And in fact, let me show you, as we have the rising motion here center in the eastern Pacific, you could really see westerly wind bursts really kick up here in the Pacific, especially as we head into early June. The CFS weekly indicating basin-wide westerly winds, so all the way stretching from the eastern Pacific to the western Pacific. So we're probably going to see quite a bit of development occur tropical activity-wise in the western Pacific too, but westerly winds centered in the eastern Pacific as well. So that'll definitely help in terms of tropical development, but most importantly, this will definitely help with the warm pool and help allow for the very, very warm waters we have below the surface to reach the surface and eventually help strengthen our El Nino even further. So this is really going to rev up over the next several weeks more than likely, and we might even still get another push of warmth that might be remaining here in the western Pacific to move eastward, and that's what's really going to help push this El Nino into really, really strong territory. So that's a look at the subsurface SST anomalies. And then we have the actual sea surface temperatures. First off, in the Atlantic, once again, very warm. And notice here the entire Gulf of Mexico already nearly, fully, filled to the brim with sea surface temperatures at or above 26 degrees Celsius, which is obviously what you need for tropical development. And as we close out the month of May, I would not be surprised if the entire Gulf here is completely filled with 26 degrees Celsius water temperatures. And especially as we get towards June and July and August and definitely into September, the Gulf will warm up even more. And that's also something to keep in mind too. More than likely, the Gulf of Mexico will be warm throughout the entire season. The Gulf of Mexico is always warm, always ready for tropical development during the hurricane season. And definitely the Caribbean too. I mean, the Caribbean is actually warm year-round, to be completely honest with you. But obviously, we're probably not going to see as much come from the Caribbean this year. So all of the warm sea surface temperatures we have here will more than likely not come into use. But something else to pay attention to: very, very warm sea surface temperatures in the Bahamas. Even in the Bahamas, we have sea surface temperatures reaching as warm as 28 to 29 degrees Celsius there. So you guys also seeing very warm sea surface temperatures too. And then slowly up the Gulf Stream as well, we're starting to see these sea surface temperatures make their way up north and probably going to fill in right against the southeast coast as well very, very soon as things continue to warm up. So sea surface temperature wise, the Atlantic is warming up very nicely. And we are also already steaming hot in the Pacific. Take a look at this. We have sea surface temperatures. These are not anomalies. These are regular sea surface temperatures. I'm not sure if I was saying anomalies before, but these are regular sea surface temperatures. Already, large portions of the basin here in the Pacific, 30 to 31 degrees Celsius. And very interestingly enough, already making their way into the Baja Peninsula here, or the bay or whatever that's kind of inside here next to the Baja Peninsula and mainland Mexico. I'm not exactly sure what this body of water is called, but that is very warm too. And even stretching into the area here near the central Mexican coastline, and that aligns almost perfectly with where sea surface temperatures are well above normal. In fact, again, some areas here reaching as high as 2 to even 3 degrees Celsius above normal. So that is definitely very interesting for sure. And I especially believe that this region in here roughly will probably really have to watch closely for a very strong hurricane season later, or not strong hurricane season, a very strong hurricane later on this year, because that especially seems to be a reoccurring theme with a lot of these El Nino years, especially later on in the season. We get a very, very strong hurricane that develops and ends up tracking through this area here, and sometimes explodes. I mean, we've had Hurricane Patricia, which has happened, and we've also had Hurricane Otis as well. So I think especially closer to Mexico here, we really got to watch, especially with the, warmth of the sea surface temperatures that we already have right now. And especially given, strong El Nino and just in general how warm things are. Mexico, I think you guys should really watch this hurricane season, but especially probably in around this region right here, especially given that we already in late May have sea surface temperatures reaching as high as 29 degrees Celsius. So, that is pretty significant and will certainly be something to watch. All right, really quickly before we end off here, because we've been going for just about an hour now. Before we end off, I want to really quickly go over with you once again all of the names that we have on the naming list this year for the Atlantic and the Pacific. And for the Atlantic, starting off with Arthur, and then Bertha, and then Cristobal, all the way down to Wilfred. And we're probably going to stop at most somewhere in this column. I'm saying we'll probably stop at about Nana or so. And by the way, if you are curious, this is the same naming list that we used in 2020, the most active hurricane season on record in the Atlantic. And yeah, it's already been 6 years since we've used that list, because if you're familiar, these naming lists recycle every 6 years. So we used this naming list before in 2020. We're now using it again this year, and we're going to recycle this naming list in 2032, except for whatever name gets retired this year. Of course, if a name will be retired this year. I think there will be, but of course, because we very well may not have a name retired. And then in the Eastern Pacific, the first name on the list is Amanda, and then Boris, and then Christina, Douglas, and then all the way down to Zeke. And the Eastern Pacific actually has 3 extra names, and they don't really use them that often. We don't really get to this portion of the naming list very often in the Eastern Pacific. But we might as well do so this year. Especially given how warm the Eastern Pacific is, and going back to the NOAA forecast, they are expecting up to 22 named storms. So that roughly puts us at Xavier. So it's very, very possible that we get very far down the Eastern Pacific naming list this year, and maybe beyond it. Maybe it's that active of a year, and this year ends up being the Eastern Pacific's 2020 or 2005, and we get beyond it. It's certainly possible, but of course, we'll see. But those are the names for this year. And that's a look at what the hurricane season forecast is from NOAA this year. We went over in depth. For the past hour, we looked at a lot of things, and if you have any questions before we wrap it up here, I'll definitely be, more than happy to answer them. And I have someone here that asks, Jacob Weaver, I believe, asked, Danilo, does less winds warm the Gulf? And I believe so, Jacob, but I believe it more has to do with, if we have a very, very strong Bermuda high, which pumps warm air from the Caribbean northward into the Gulf, and especially if we have a very, very strong southeast ridge with the heat wave over the southeast, that ends up, reflecting onto the Gulf as well. So I believe that plays much more of a role into whether or not, the actual zonal winds, surface winds are strong in the Gulf. But I'm pretty sure that, probably does have something to do with it as well. But if there are no other questions, I think we're going to wrap it up here. Very, very long discussion. And, we'll see if NOAA's forecast ends up panning out. I believe it will, but obviously Mother Nature sometimes has other plans for us. And I mean, we've seen years like 2018 expected to be El Nino, expected to be below normal. And it ends up not happening like that. 2018 was still active. I mean, very active compared to what was expected. But 2018, we still ended up having a storm like Michael and Florence occur. So I would not let your guard down this season, regardless of the fact that it's supposed to be a not so active season. And of course, that itself can change, especially if El Nino ends up not being as strong, or if the Atlantic ends up warming up significantly. We'll see. But more than likely, the Atlantic hurricane season will be not as active this year, while the Pacific will be very, very active. But of course, we'll see exactly if that pans out. And Jacob wants me to check the 10-meter wind speed map. Okay, let's go to the 10-meter winds. What exactly do you want me to look at, Jacob? Because I'll focus it here in the Atlantic, if I can find it. Oh no, that's the ensembles. Okay, here's the 10-meter winds. What do you want to see? Because I mean, that is a pretty strong storm here that the GFS shows, but I mean, there's not really much to see here. I mean, we do have pretty brisk trades that occur throughout the Caribbean, and then eventually that flows into the Gulf. I mean, we already have a pretty decently strong Bermuda high that's in place. So, that'll definitely help pump warm water from the Caribbean into the Gulf. And then let's see what happens in the Eastern Pacific here. Not much happening as well, though you can see that we start seeing some sort of cyclonic turning here, and then eventually the GFS does try to show something develop here. In the Pacific. So wait, you say you want to see the Gulf warming setup. Okay. Well, again, it's really going to be dependent on how the Bermuda high sets up. It's the Gulf warming mainly happens from us having a very strong Bermuda high, which helps pump a lot of warm water from the Caribbean northward into the Gulf. And, that really seems to happen pretty significantly, especially as we get towards next week. So definitely over the next week or so, I say the Gulf is probably going to warm up pretty significantly, and will definitely be toasty by the time we get to June, and definitely by the time we get to hurricane, or by the time we get to the peak of hurricane season. The Gulf is not as affected by El Nino as, let's say the Caribbean is. So we'll see what happens. Maybe something might happen in the Gulf this year, but the Gulf is not as affected by El Nino as the Caribbean. Although we typically don't really see that much activity happen in an El Nino year in the Gulf of America, I should say. But of course, this year might be an exception. I mean, Michael did happen in the Gulf, so things do happen in the Gulf sometimes in El Nino years. So we'll just, in general, have to see how warm the Gulf ends up being this year. But it'll definitely be more than enough for something to happen, and probably more than warm enough for a major hurricane to happen if the opportunity, of course, does arise. But of course, we'll see. All right, but I think I'm going to end it off here. Nothing much else to go over. Thank you all for tuning into today's live stream on NOAA's hurricane forecasts, and we will be watching over the next 180 to 190 days what exactly happens in the Atlantic and if exactly NOAA's forecast pans out. But at least for today, not much else happening, so looks like we're going to end it off here. Thanks for watching. Thanks for tuning in. Enjoy. Oh, and really quickly, hello to Bad Weather Freak. I used to follow you a lot. Hello, Danilo. Long time no see. Long time no see to you, Bad Weather Freak. Thanks so much for tuning in. But unfortunately, I was just about to wrap up here. So still nice to see you, anyways. But was just about to wrap up. But nice to see you on, and I hope to see you on much more as we continue on throughout this hurricane season. So nice to see you all. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and I will talk to you guys again later on.